Prova, prova. Ah. Now it's too loud already. So I was saying, as you may imagine, studying the genesis and the textual variants in the Duke of Parma, it was and it's not being an easy task, especially because the analysis of the genesis of unpublished work brings into relief what is commonly defined as the internal contradiction of genetic criticism. In fact, as João Dionisio already mentioned today, although genetic criticism seeks to avoid teleological approaches and to treat the final version of a text as a regulative horizon rather than a definitive endpoint, it is nonetheless true that the latest, more polished version of a work occupy a distinct position within the genetic dossier when compared with the previous stages of the composition. The critical relevance of the avant text thus lies in the possibility of comparing progressive stages of writing, making visible the dynamics of textual evolution. Whether published or merely polished without reaching publication, the latest version of a text typically functions as a privileged point of comparison for early stages of composition. All preceding stages correspond to a search for adequate formulation, and in the case of unpublished, unfinished, fragmentary works, as in the case of the Duke of Parma, it is possible to assume that such a moment was never reached and that authorial intention never fully stabilized in written form. Yet, even incomplete, drafts preserve traces of this search, and the revisions and reformulation they contain allow us to observe a process oriented toward expression, although never crossing the finish line. It is the case of the Duke of Parma, as you already may have imagined today, a piece testified only by a manuscript corpus, and whose avant text is hence basically comprised by only one witness. Although I have to add a marginal note here that the avant text is not a fixed documentary entity, but rather a critical construct which is defined retrospectively and arbitrarily in relation to the final work. So from this perspective, the avant text of the Duke of Parma could potentially be extended to include additional materials that fall outside the manuscript corpus that I will examine today. As such materials would include, for example, documents bearing traces of Pessoa's reading of Shakespeare, such as marginal notes, annotations in volume from his private library, which may have served as inspiration, but also, for example, genetic documentation related to Pessoa's attempts at translating Shakespeare. But today I will focus just on the documents directly related to the composition of the work. But I intend to expand the avant text in following research. Apart from the lists in which the title Duke of Parma is mentioned, the manuscripts directly related to the play are preserved in two folders, as we saw in Pessoa's archive, comprising globally 184 documents, most of them written on both recto and verso. The material is highly heterogeneous in terms of paper type, writing instruments. No fair copies exist, at least I couldn't find them, and only a very small number of documents were dated by Fernando Pessoa. These characteristics of the Duke of Parma's avant text, together with the interpretative limitations they impose, make it difficult to catalog the manuscripts on the basis of chronology or clearly defined stages of revision. However, the manuscripts of the Duke of Parma can be divided, or I wanted to divide them into two principal categories, corresponding to the compositional stages in the genesis of text they are related to, the phase of planning and the phase of writing, although not in a very common way, as we will see later. The majority of the documents belong to the second category and transmit the text of the play itself, so they are related to a redaction phase, in forms of multi-page structured dialogues between characters, but also isolated passages, scattered lines, or single phrases jotted down without clear attribution to a specific speaker. A small group of documents, however, can be associated with the planning phase, consisting of authorial notes on character description or schematic outlines of the plot. This categorization, as I anticipated, however, is not chronological, but rather typological, in the sense that, as I will try to demonstrate, the documents related to the planning of the tragedy do not necessarily correspond to a compositional phase that preceded the writing of the text itself. So generally, the planification phase is something that happens before the redaction phase, but in this case, I'm not sure that this is what happened. The plot structure was delineated by Fernando Pessoa mainly in two documents. these two documents. And a comparison between these two documents reveals that the overall structure of the plot is essentially analogous, despite the fact that the scheme jotted down in document 1142/4 is considerably more detailed, including not only a description of the scenes for each act, but also showing evidence of more extensive revision when compared to the other documents, which displays fewer authorial interventions. The correction observable in this second document that I mentioned mainly consists in the substitution of the character name Vincenzo with Valerio, which finds a clear counterpart in the dramatic text itself, where the character, who's an older chancellor who seeks to exploit the Duke's madness in order to plot against him and Alberto and thereby gain power somehow, appears predominantly under the name Valerio. Although I have to say that most of the time, Pessoa just wrote the initial letter V, so we don't know if it could be Vincenzo and Valerio. This document also contains a substantial addition to the description of the second act, in which the relationship between Valerio and Alberto is further developed. This addition emphasizes Alberto's contempt for Valerio and thereby reinforces the rivalry between these two characters. The expanded description of Act 2 appears to correspond to two textual segments of the play, which are preserved in document 11.4d14 to 18 and 11.5d1. So there is a correspondence between these addition that Pessoa made in the plot structure and text and documents related to the text of the play. A further addition in this document slightly modifies the end of Act 3, in which the Duke insults the Cardinal and, according to the authorial addition, also the Bishop. And this addition is followed by a question mark, indicating Pessoa's hesitation. Nevertheless, this addition also appears to be confirmed by the plot development, as evidenced in document 11.5d 45 to 55 to 56, where the Duke threatens the Bishop with having him attacked by his hounds. So in other words, the description of the acts added here by Pessoa seem to coincide with the textual content of existing documents bearing the text of the play. So bear this in mind, because this element is important to understand why I think that the planification phase of the Duke of Parma cannot be assimilated to a typical planification phase that occurred before the reduction of the text itself. The plan outlined in the other document underwent a more radical process of revision, as I mentioned. Here, the structure of the play is written in reverse order, as João already showed, and the indication backward was added by Fernando Pessoa himself at the top of the page. The most substantial rearrangement concerns the fifth act, as the entire sequence was renumbered, but this modification appears to have been made primarily for reasons of clarity, given the fact that Pessoa initially drafted the document backward, and so he wanted to renumber probably the order of the scene to obtain a more coherent overview of the play structure. A rearrangement of scene sequencing also affects the structure of the second act, where the interventions seem to reflect a more deliberate reconsideration. The manuscript suggests that Pessoa hesitated over the orderings of scene 4, 5, and 7. Scene 4 is described as one in which the Duke ill-treats Girolamo's friends, while scene 5 is described as a scene in which the Duchess and Hermione decided to send for Valerio Vincenzo. Pessoa hesitated about the sequencing of these scenes, as demonstrated by two half circles drawn around this number 4 and 5, together with an arrow pointing toward a further scene description at the bottom of the page concerning Alberto's monologue on his position, purposes, and ambitions. One possible interpretation is that Pessoa considered inverting the order of scenes 4 and 5 and replacing one of them with the content written at the bottom of the page. However, a second arrow links this latter description with scene 7, further complicating the reconstruction of the intended sequence, as you may have imagined by now. The difficulty of defining a stable ordering of scenes is exacerbated by the absence of any surviving draft clearly corresponded to either the Duchess and Hermione's decision to send for V, at least I couldn't find any, and also episode in which clearly the Duke ill-treats Girolamo's friends. I don't know if there are some documents. I couldn't find any document that is clearly related to this description. Other insertions in the manuscript, by contrast, do find clear counterparts in the draft of the play, and appear to have been introduced with the aim of clarifying the relationship between the plot outline and textual passages that Pessoa had likely already composed, according to the same modus operandi that we saw before. So within this context, the addition of the specification, "we are naked," here, in the description of the second scene of Act 5, seems intended to clarify the reference to the Duke's nonsense bitter talk, which is in the description of the scene. This description closely matches the content of document 1140-100, where the sentence "we are naked" is repeated twice and forms part of a monologue characterized by precisely such a tone. So it could be a nonsense bitter talk. Similarly, the description of the second scene of Act 4 contains two substantial marginal additions, which again appears designed to refine the scene's content and connect it more directly to the dramatic text. There is an addition of the detail D, so the Duke describes his symptoms in the description of the fifth scene of Act 4, and a note added on the right for description of scene 2, which states that Valerio agrees with the second chancellor to speak to the Duke. Both additions appear to serve a similar function, to enrich the scene outline and explicitly link to pre-existing textual draft. The fact that they are pre-existing is my assumption, of course. The D described the symptoms description is in fact linked with the text preserved in document 11.5D8, which is a Duke's monologue in which he describes that one. And is a Duke's monologue in which he described the specificities of his madness, or he's describing symptoms. And the other addition corresponds closely to the content of these other documents, in which Valerio addresses a character who is defined as 2, as you can maybe see in Romanic numbers, so presumably is the second chancellor, declaring himself both loyal to him and committed to justice and truth. This evidence may suggest that the plot outline in document 11.4D2 was not drafted during an initial planning stage of the compositional process, but rather at a later phase, when part of the play's text had already been written and the author felt the need to organize existing materials and anticipate further development. That's why the documents witnessing a planification phase in the Duke of Parma may not correspond to a previous phase of planning that preceded the redaction, but rather to a phase of reorganization, we could call it, or clarification, in which Pessoa wanted to work on the play structure based on the dramatic text he had already composed. This would have several implications in the analysis of Pessoa's compositional process, the main one being the demonstration that the author gives priority to the dramatic discourse rather than to the dramatic narrative or plot, which is something that the analysis of the variants that I will carry out today also should confirm or would confirm. And also, just a little reminder, this is the only dated documents among the ones that are related to additions in the plot. So the other ones are not dated. So this could also be maybe useful or maybe not at all for dating all the documents that are related to the plot. Other documents related to the Duke of Parma do not transmit either the text of the play or its plot structure, but instead focus on the delineation of its characters. In this respect, two documents devoted to the character of Alberto are of particular relevance, as they provide valuable insight into his defining traits and into the ways in which Pessoa worked on the modification over time. In this document, Alberto is defined as unsentimental, cynical, and unintellectual. This is the transcription, but well, you can trust on me. It's cynical, unsentimental, and intellectual. In this other document, by contrast, the characterization of Alberto provides a different and more coherent context for the construction of this character, however, not fully coinciding with the profile outlined in the previous document. Here, Alberto's characterization relies less on intellectual traits and places greater emphasis on his emotional instability. The initial adjective affective, but maybe it was not affective, it was affectionate or something like that, is corrected to liable to wavering through affection, shifting the emphasis from an inherent emotional disposition to a susceptibility that undermines Alberto's self-perception. This revision suggests a character who is less cynical and more emotionally vulnerable than he believes himself to be. Similarly, the choice of the adjective vengeful reinforces this interpretation, highlighting Alberto's tendency to react emotionally and to be driven by passion rather than embodying the figure of a purely intellectual character as it was described in the previous document. Move on to textual variants. When access to multiple witnesses is unavailable, either because they never existed or because they have been lost, genetic criticism necessarily shifts from its interdocumentary comparative framework to an intradocumentary analysis approach. In the case of one witness avant-text, well, once again, avant-text is not one witness, it has not to be one witness in the case of the Duke of Parma, but let's pretend it is. The comparative dimension of genetic criticism no longer lies in the confrontation of distinct documents, but rather in the identification and comparison of different writing and revision stages observable within the same manuscript corpus. This reconstruction is based on the observation of points on non-linearity within the manuscripts. Such points can be identified through paleographic analysis by distinguishing different stages of intervention on the basis of writing instrument, something we could not really rely in the case of the Duke of Parma, and spatial placement of textual segments on the place. So non-linearity are all that places on a text in which there is a detachment between the regular course of writing, so from left to right, from top to bottom. Textual elements detached from the main text portion and positioned in peripheral zone of the page are typically interpreted as non-linear interventions, so corrections. This assumption, however, does not always hold in the case of the Duke of Parma. Here, the displacement of text into the margins, particularly in the case of extended passages, may have resulted from practical constraints, such as lack of space. Rather than from an intentional revision, in such instances, the author may simply have continued an impulsive and rapid drafting process in the available margin space. Here are two examples. The first example, it will not be considered, I will not be considering it as a variant or an object of analysis for the purpose of this paper, because Pessoa could have used the margin just because of lack of space. While the second example can be considered a variant or a correction, an addition, because there were no reason for Pessoa to not use the remaining places of the page to continue in writing. Although I'm not sure I'm still agreeing with myself on that. But still, there are other examples could have been more effective, but still. In order to restrict the object of analysis, and now I'm gonna agree with the next slide. So in order to restrict the object of analysis to size of intentional revision, and thus to treat only genuine corrective operations as variants, large-scale emendations are here defined according to the two following criteria. One, they introduce a revision, whether by substitution, alternative formulation, or addition, of a textual segment that consists of at least 2 sentences, so it's a large-scale emendation. And two, their displacement cannot be explained by a lack of space in the main writing area of the page. The second criterion is met when either the addition displays paleographic features indicating that it was not produced in the course of linear drafting, or when it is executed using a different writing instrument. By observing large-scale emendations according to these criteria and comparing them systematically, it becomes possible to identify a general corrective intention in large-scale emendation, which is the expansion and specification of character traits and the relationships among them. In the majority of cases, large-scale emendations appear to serve the purpose of intensifying the Duke expression of madness and emotional disturbance. This document, for example, provides a particularly illustrative example. The manuscript records a dialogue between the Duke and a character designated by the letter M, so it's Alberto, the minister. The exchange concerns Valerio and appears to begin on the verse of the page, where the Duke asks Alberto whether Valerio possesses much of a great man. The dialogue continues on the recto, where the two agree that Valerio is not, in fact, a great man. It is likely that Pessoa initially interrupted the dialogue midway through the recto at the point where this agreement is reached. At a later stage, however, he returned to the document and added in pencil an additional speech by the Duke. This added passage is not strictly connected to the preceding exchange, but instead takes the form of an emotional outburst in which the Duke declares that something is coming over him, presumably a surge of madness, and asks Alberto not to look at him and to leave. You didn't see the transcription. Once again, you will have to trust me because I have to move on. But so it is an addition that is really not linked with the rest of the dialogue. Since there is no clear semantic or dialogic connection between the added lines and the surrounding exchange, the function of the addition appears to be primarily to portray the Duke as a figure prone to sudden outbursts of madness rather than to advance with the dialogue itself. A comparable pattern can be observed in other large-scale emendations, such as this one. This manuscript records a dialogue between the Duke and the Bishop of the theme on the theme of dirtiness. The dialogue consists of two main segments written in blue ink on the rectum verso of the page, the latter headed by the number 2. 3 further additions were subsequently introduced in the upper and left margins of the verso, apparently using 2 or 3 different writing instruments, so different stages. The first step intensifies the Duke's awareness of his own madness, explicitly articulated in the line, "I'm ill at heart," while the other 2 reinforce its manifestation in action. In these latter cases, the Duke orders someone to escort the bishop out and threatens to have him attacked by his hounds, as I've already said. A brief 2-line exchange is also added between the Duke and the bishop, in which the Duke angrily repeats his words, "Done, done, out, out, out." These additions do not advance the plot, but rather amplify the performative expression of the Duke's rageous behavior. Dialogues involving the bishop, in fact, appear repeatedly to function as a narrative device through which the Duke's madness is triggered somehow or intensified. This is also the case of this other document, which preserves a monologue devoted to the Duke's experience of madness. The textual portions that were added at the bottom of both recto and verso further accentuate the description of his emotional outbursts. In the first added passage, the Duke regrets having sent something away, and probably is referring to the bishop, as we saw in the previous document, when we were saying out, out, out. In this document, he describes his anger as a sudden, uncontrollable eruption. Once again, the Duke expresses a desire to be left alone, echoing the addition observed in the previous document. On the verso, 2 further additions deepen this portrayal by elaborating on what the Duke calls a twilight saneness and by describing a renewed storm affecting his soul. In these passages, the Duke's emotional collapse is further intensified through the addition of stage direction that dramatizes his despair. He repeatedly invokes God, expresses a desire to die, shakes, hides his face in his hands, and tears open his collar. In this other document, the Duke's rage and instability are emphasized through a different strategy, a reflection placed in the bishop's mouth. The manuscript records a dialogue between the Duke and the bishop on carnality and, once again, dirtiness. An additional remark, written at the bottom of the verse in a different writing instrument, and therefore likely introduced at a later stage, frames the Duke's condition from the bishop's perspective. The devil of the flesh has entered him, albeit in strange wise and worthily, rather in the act. This is most strange, but is not pleasant strange. This addition appears designed to reinforce the perception of the Duke's madness by externalizing it through another character's judgment. Taken together, this large-scale emendation suggests that the bishop is conceived as a character whose function is to provoke the Duke's outburst of madness, insanity, and rage. It is plausible that these additions were produced during the same revision phase, maybe, or at least according to a shared corrective intention. In other cases, large-scale emendations serve to deepen the Duke's relationship with other characters. Just to give you a brief example, there is here a graphite pencil addition that introduces a short speech by Alberto that clarifies his perception on the Duke's nature. The dialogue already establishes Alberto's admiration for the Duke's honesty. He says, "Your soul wears nothing," but the other lines make this admiration more explicit. There's value in him. He must not be best cursed to the blind where I thought most darkly towards him. Other characters are similarly refined through large-scale emendation, as is the case of Valerio. In this document, this document, 19, a substantial graphite pencil addition at the bottom of the verse introduces a speech by a character designed as M, so once again Alberto, offering a more articulate assessment of Valerio. The dialogue initially concerns Alberto's interpretation of the Duke's madness, and the other passage, however, opens abruptly with what? Valerio, without any direct connection to the preceding exchange, and proceeds to define Valerio as a clever fool and thus the excellence of mediocrity. Once again, there is no evident connection between the added passage and the rest of the exchange. It seems that this addition was made only with the purpose of specifying Alberto's opinion on Valerio, clarifying the relationship between the two characters. A similar intention to deepen Valerio's characterization can be observed in these other documents in which Valerio speaks to the second minister, expressing suspicion toward Alberto and accusing him of plotting against him. A later addition articulates Valerio's self-representation as loyal to the Duke, the state, and the general good. Small-scale emendations. Before delving into the analysis of substantive small-scale emendation, a very brief remark, because I found it very curious, that the fact that one striking feature of the play's compositional process is the high frequency of substitutions with identical replacement. I don't know if there is a specific term in English for that. In Portuguese, retorno. I think there is no specific term. We could work on that with Vidit, Ali. So there are those cases in which Pessoa deletes a word and replaces it with the same exact word. A total of 50 occurrences has been identified across the manuscript corpus, which represent approximately 11% of all the small-scale emendations in the manuscript of the Duke of Parma. This is more like, a creative process than a math process to count every variation, textual variant in the Duke of Parma, but approximately is 11%. Although this type of variant does not alter the semantic content of the text, it cannot be fully classified as accidental or non-substantive, so not of critical relevance, because they record a moment of authorial hesitation. While hesitation is hardly surprising in Pessoa's compositional practice, particularly in light of the fact that the Duke of Parma remained unpublished and unfinished, and that Pessoa kept writing in the course of almost 3 decades, it is none less significant that such hesitation concerns specific lexical choices, even within a work that is highly fragmentary and structurally unstable. This suggests that for Pessoa, linguistic expression was at least as crucial as, and perhaps even more crucial than, the overall structural coherence of the play. More generally, and as a preliminary synthesis of the characteristics of small-scale emendation, it can be argued that the majority of these variants were introduced with the aim of enhancing the stylistic quality of the text. This is observable both at the level of lexical choices and also in the modulation of syntactic and rhetorical effects with the aim of heightening the lyrical tone of the play. This process, and I will show example of every kind of process. These are examples of every kind of process. Operates predominantly through 4 strategies: the adoption of metaphoric and more overtly poetic construction, so part of me does lost epilogue to my soul, the inversion of the conventional syntactic order, so almost the body is almost, or I ask myself this, what is myself, I ask this. The reinforcement of a Shakespearean idiom through the introduction of archaic linguistic form, like it was, and the substitution of common lexical items with more refined or unusual synonyms, as agree and accord. At times, lexical choices adopted by Fernando Pessoa during the revision process of the Duke of Parma, particularly in use of adjectives, reveal a clear authorial intention to reshape or more precisely define both character description and interpersonal relationship. A small number of examples can illustrate how adjectival choices function to enhance the characterization of specific traits of characters. Like in this document that contains part of a dialogue between the Duchess and another unidentified character. And in this exchange, the Duchess expressed concern that the Duke's behavior may provoke treason. She speaks about the Duke's madness, if she's fabricated or deliberate, etc. And she subsequently appeals to her interlocutor for assistance. During the revision of this dialogue, Pessoa introduced 2 adjectival additions that contributes to the Duchess characterization. Lady becomes gracious lady, and your hands having becomes your fine hands having. The addition of these adjectives, gracious and fine, the latter referring to the Duchess' hands, appears to respond to an unified revisional intention. This modification reinforced the interlocutor's admiration for the Duchess, an attitude already evident throughout the dialogue, while simultaneously sharpening the delineation of the Duchess' personal idiosyncrasies. Both the additions of fine hands and gracious lady contribute to the enhancement of the Duchess' femininity and elegance, and on a metaphorical level to the articulation of her affectionate disposition. At the same time, these adjectives foreground the atmosphere of mutual respect that characterizes the exchange between the Duchess and her interlocutor, which is also further reinforced by an additional revision introduced by Pessoa in the opening line of the Duchess' speech. She said at the beginning, "My lord, I heard that you were," and then he added, "I am most glad to meet you, I heard that you were," etc., etc. From a complementary perspective, this substitution of lady with gracious lady may also be interpreted in light of a specific category of variants recurrent in the manuscripts of the play, which affect forms of address. Such variants are particularly significant from a dramaturgical standpoint because they make visible the author's intention to the delineation of interpersonal relationship between characters. This table presents Fernando Pessoa's revision on the forms of address within the text of the play, revealing a consistent authorial concern with this dimension of the play's text. As the table indicates, Pessoa frequently hesitates in his lexical choices among forms of address such as sir, lord, highness, lordship, madam, or lady. In some cases, these variants appear interchangeable because there is no such a difference in referring to the Duke as my lord or your lordship. But in other cases, these revisions serve to clarify the interpersonal relationship between characters, so acquiring a distinct dramaturgical significance. A particularly revealing case is found in these documents, both of which contain dialogues in which characters are engaged in plotting against Alberto. In the document 20, the speakers are identified as A and B. In this case, A does not stand for Alberto, it's just an undefined character. And in document 37, the speakers are Girolamo, the Duke's brother, and X, one of his followers, probably. In both cases, the variants concerning forms of address appear to be directly connected to the conspirational nature of the exchanges. In document 20, the addition of the adjective good, our good, in reference to Lord Alberto, introduces a clear note of irony. This sarcastic inflection becomes evident in light of the surrounding dialogue, in which the character express a wish for the duchy to descend into disorder, while declaring their intention to remain inactive, waiting for others to strain against each other, including the good Alberto. The revised form of address thus functions as a subtle marker of duplicity within the plotting discourse. A comparable mechanism is observed in the other document when Girolamo and X once again conspire against Alberto. While X consistently refers to Alberto as the Lord Alberto, Pessoa revises Girolamo's speech to remove the honorific Lord in two occurrences. And here, Girolamo refers to Alberto either solely by his name or through the distancing expression that Alberto, in contrast to X's more deferential usage. So this suggests an intentional characterization strategy. Pessoa appears to emphasize Girolamo's lack of respect for Alberto, a figure with whom he entertains a strong rivalry and whom he seeks to undermine. So in this case, revision to form of address operate not merely as a stylistic refinement, but as meaningful indicators of power relations, hostility, and strategic positioning within the dramatic conflict. Last typology is stage directions. Despite the dramatic nature of the Duke of Parma, the majority of the surviving manuscripts do not contain explicit stage directions, suggesting that Pessoa's primary focus during the composition lies in the redaction of dialogues and monologues, rather than in the detailed articulation of performative elements. A noteworthy feature is the uneven distribution of such interventions. Stage directions are added systematically only in a limited number of documents and dialogues. This concentration suggests that Pessoa developed a clear sense of the performative dimension for certain scenes, while leaving others comparatively underdetermined in this respect. This document provides a significant example. It is headed with the title "Less Words of Penultimate Scene," but contain almost no speech dialogue. And consists primarily of a description of Alberto's action, here identified as M. The textual variants observable in this document testify to Pessoa's intention to revise and refine the performative dimension of the scene. These variants do not substantially alter the sequence of action, but rather enrich it through the addition of details. Pessoa initially describes Alberto as taking the papers from his pocket, and later adds the indication he's moving away. A further stage direction introduces hesitation by suggesting that Alberto is close to tearing the papers before stopping, and the action of dropping the papers is revised so as to diminish deliberate intentionality, proposing instead that the papers fall slowly from Alberto's hands. While the action itself remains unchanged, the other details allow for a more precise and intentional visualization of the scene. An analogous revision process can be observed in this other document, which contains a dialogue between the Duke and the nurse at the end of the play, right before Duke's death. The genetic transcription of the rector shows that the vast majority of Pessoa's additions consist of parenthetical stage direction, which are introduced with the same writing instrument. So in our revision stage, this is probably very close to the writing stage of the document. The density and precision of the stage direction in this document reach a level unmatched elsewhere in the corpus of the Duke of Parma. This concentration likely reflects Pessoa's particular attention to this important scene of the tragedy, the scene of the Duke's death, conceived as the moment suggests a heightened concern for performative realization alongside verbal expression. The other stage direction describe relatively simple actions, the nurse that touches the Duke's chest, the Duke moving towards the bed, the nurse following him, the Duke sitting down, interrupting her, etc. And despite their simplicity, these directions offer an almost unique opportunity within the corpus of the piece to visualize the scene in its entirety, not only as a verbal exchange, but also as a staged event. In this respect, they provide valuable insight into Pessoa's sporadic but highly focused engagement with the performative dimension of his dramatic writing. Conclusions, because you are already exhausted, as I can see from your faces. The genetic analysis of the Duke of Parma demonstrates that even in the case of highly fragmentary, chaotic, and heterogeneous corpus of manuscripts, it is nevertheless possible to identify meaningful connections among systems of textual variants. A critical examination of the Genesis of the Duke of Parma allows us, I think, to formulate three principal reflections. First, the study of the work's Genesis proved particularly illuminating with regard to editorial practices. The analysis of variants affecting plot outlines and structural annotations suggests that certain additions were introduced in order to create connections, links, with textual segments that Pessoa had likely already drafted. Such observation not only clarified the internal chronology of the Sovavi manuscript, but also offered concrete criteria for dating individual documents, as I said. These findings are therefore not merely descriptive, but they bear directly on the establishment of a critical edition. Second, at the level of small-scale emendations, Pessoa demonstrated a remarkable attention to stylistic precision. The cases of replacement without semantic alteration reveal a careful and almost surgical reflection on language itself, even at moments when the broader conception of the work remained fragmentary. In general, the evidence of small-scale emendation points out to sustained efforts to refine tone, elevate expression, and adapt the text to the specific variety of English Pessoa was using. And third, and more broadly, this study contributes to addressing a persistent gap in Pessoa scholarship. His dramatic productions have long occupied a marginal position within critical discourse. As a result, our understanding of his compositional strategies in this genre has remained limited. By focusing on both large-scale and small-scale emendation, I have tried to argue that the revision in the Duke of Parma is not primarily oriented toward structural reorganization or plot development. Rather, it functions as a site of semantic intensification and dramaturgical refinement, most notably in the description of character and the dynamics between them. So in this respect, Pessoa's primary dramatic concerns appear to lie less in performative staging than in the construction of characters. Such an emphasis resonates with the well-known critical interpretation of Pessoa's authorial idiosyncrasy as a dramatic poet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlota. And while Carlota gets her breath back, over to Professor Portela, who I would invite to comment on what we have just heard.
Thank you. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers, Enrico Martinez, Carlota de Fenu, and Andrea Ragusa. Also, thank you, João Dionísio, for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been learning a lot about Pessoa and about this project. As the meeting goes on, I realize how well this has been organized in terms of the structure of the papers. No, this was really thought through. No, because we started off with looking at the material and graphical elements in the manuscripts and typescripts in the witnesses, and we now and also organizing and then the encoding, and now we move on to the interpretation of, let's say, at a more literary level of the contents of the text. And when I was reading Carlotta's paper, I thought, what can I say? You know, she's so thorough, so systematic, so perceptive, so really acute in the observations that she makes about the text and the possibility of reading the text, that I thought, well, I have nothing to say really. So, but I decided that maybe I could challenge some of the, let's say, the genetic claims about the nature of the relation between text and avant-text, which I think are part of the theoretical framework for the presentation. So this is my my gift to the previous panel. The encoding of my response to Carlotta's paper. And then, actually, I only have two topics, although the first topic will be broken down into all of these questions, 7 questions. So where is the text of the avant-text? Is the transcription the avant-text? Is the transcription an after-text of an avant-text without a text? Is the transcription the text? Is the Duke of Parma in the digital archive the conflation of transcription as avant-text with transcription as text? Is there a text in this text? Are we mad yet? So I think that this morning when Nicolas and Jerónimo started their presentation with making a sort of an allegory about the process of reading and, well, the textual, philological, critical approach to texts as a kind of madness. And the fact that they used the references to madness in the Duke of Parma itself, I think really hit a nerve, I think, in my mind. So most of these questions were thought of this morning when I was listening to you. And I was also struck when Enrico introduced the whole project, and he mentioned Carlotta's and in general the approach that you were taking to the manuscripts and the typescripts, so the witnesses, as not just looking at the usus scribendi, but usus creandi. So this also struck me as a way of looking at the process rather than at the, let's say, the objective marks on the paper or some kind of interpretation of what those marks may mean. So I will start with I will have some quotes, and I will, from the paper, and I will ask questions about those quotes. And I will start with some notes that I have here. So, Carlotta de Fenus, The Genesis of Fernando Pessoa's Duke of Parma, a critical examination, offers an extremely insightful discussion of the problems raised by any attempt to provide a genetic account of Fernando Pessoa's Duke of Parma. In her paper, she highlights several material and textual features of the witnesses and the specific problems created by an unfinished, incomplete, and highly fragmentary work. She frames her discussion within the geneticist avant-text theoretical framework for grounding the methodological challenges posed by the witnesses. This framing is, in my view, a major strength of her paper, as it allows us to clearly see the limitations of genetic accounts for works in progress that remain in progress. My first set of comments and questions will focus on what I see as the limits of genetic accounts. Without a finalized work against which drafts, revisions, and variants can be compared, there is only Genesis. The avant-textness of the avant-text remains undetermined. There is no aftertext to establish the avant-textness of the avant-text, which begs the question, what kind of theoretical transformation is necessary so that the concept of avant-text can be applied to these witnesses? What we have here is the layered flux of textual production in its unruly, chaotic, temporary, embodied expression. What the witnesses show is the inherently fragmentary nature of textual production as a process of exploring ever-changing verbal connections through addition, ramification, deletion, revision. The expanded cognitive system created by the marks of writing on paper enable writers to experiment with verbal structures and linguistic associations. It is interesting to see Carlotta's attempt to adopt a genetic criticism framework, as when she writes, and I quote, "The choices through which an author preserves, modifies, or eliminates material during the genesis of a work delineate a field of potentiality from which the text emerges, revealing its specific orientations and idiosyncrasies." I think I have this quote here. Do I? Yeah. While also underlining the exegetical openness of fragmentary works, as when she quotes from Neistat, stating that the fragment functions as, and I quote from her quote, "synecdoche in which the reader expands the form as a space of tension that opens possibilities of reading that trigger the reader's interpretation." So I think what I realized when I was reading your paper was that you were creating the form. So you were creating the form for the text by the connections that you were making across the different fragments. And this comes from page 3 in your paper. In the case of unpublished, unfinished, and fragmentary works, it is plausible to assume that such a moment was never reached and that the authorial intention never fully stabilized in written form. Yet, even in incomplete drafts, preserve traces of this search, and the revisions and reformulations they contain allow us to observe a process oriented toward expression. Although never crossing the finish line, a movement in which the author does not arrive at what he voulait écrire, but persistently tends toward it. So my question here is, how do you see your role as a reader in creating the form for this play? Because I have the sense that you were, as I saw your interpretation of the characters, of the plot, of the different explanations for the revisions, that you were creating the form of the text. No? So is that how you see your role as a textual scholar?
Have to answer right now. while you were saying that, I was thinking about the fact that while I was writing this paper, I thought, well, at the beginning I was regretting all my choices in life, but then I thought that if I hadn't had to study the variants and the textual variants in the manuscript of the Duke of Parma, I probably would have never reached the comprehension of the text that I had reached through the study of the Genesis. Because the fact that I had to take the variants into consideration, considering a system of variants, so having to create connections and links between the variants, actually, in a sense, yes, create a text, create a form of a text, but also gives to you the opportunity to have a more deep comprehension of the text itself, I think. Of course, it is a matter, I think that this is a question of the link between edition and interpretation. I think that this interpretation is the interpretation of Genesis of a play. It is a way also to build an edition of the play. So it is in a way of creating a form of the text, of course. As I mentioned with the analysis of the plot structure and the fact that probably it's not a planning phase that preceded, but something that was written after the composition of some text. So yeah, of course, you are creating a form because you are establishing links, and the links that I have established could have been others, and maybe João Dionísio looking at variants will think completely different things, and you probably will highlight completely different things. So of course, you are creating kind of a parallel text of the avant text to kind of find the links and the connection between the textual variants.
Yeah. Okay, so that is one interesting aspect of the way we behave in relation to these types of texts, because the text, we often refer to the text as some kind of transcendental element in the process of trying to come to terms with this very complex, fragmentary, unfinished. But the text does not really exist, no? So we only have avant text, no? And if the text does not exist, the avant text is not avant text, it's a text, no? And so my point is that I don't know if the thinking in terms of an ideality, you know, that we have some kind of text, whether that helps us to really look at what we have in front of us and look at the process as a process rather than as something that is looking to become something else, no? And that, I think that for me, that is one of the challenges of these kinds of projects, no? That we have, well, sometimes we work towards a horizon that is really some kind of projection of an ideality, some kind of transcendental form that is not there. So if that form is going to be there, it's us. We are inventing that form. We are creating those connections that allow us to ascribe some kind of unified intention or unified form to the Duke of Parma, no? So again, I think this was also really evident also in your presentation, no? It's a really wonderful reading of, so I would say that as some of the editors who have been transcribing and encoding the text have enabled us to decipher the marks on the papers, you have been able to really give us some kind of literary rationale for the whole text. No, the text seems to have some coherence that it's very difficult to think of if we stay with the material elements. And so by observing large-scale emendations according to these criteria and comparing them systematically, it becomes possible to identify a general corrective intention, the expansion and specification of character traits, and of the relationships between characters. So you already demonstrated that with several quotes. So my second and last question is this one. So, and again, this goes back to the topic that was introduced this morning between deciphering and interpreting, and we could make the same point about encoding and interpreting. So there's always some kind of inseparability between ascribing some kind of distinguishing function to a mark and doing that through an interpretive framework that will read the mark in a specific way. So in your text, you very, I think, carefully and in a way that's very difficult to not to agree with, you go through this intra-documentary, small-scale, large-scale analysis to show that there is some kind of tendency, some kind of overall system that presides over the process of revision. So my question here is this one. What is the relation between deciphering the text and interpreting the rationale for the emendations at both the small scale and large scale? In other words, are there instances where text can only be tentatively read when stabilized into a given transcription because that would fit the inferred pattern of composition and revision? So in a way, we saw this kind of problem also illustrated when Carlos Pitella showed that intertextual network of relations with other texts that Pessoa might have read, or even with other texts by other heteronyms, and we could see that maybe some of those links would allow us to read what seemed like illegible text. So in your experience, how can you describe your reading of the emendations in terms of your overall interpretive framework?
Yes, I would, this is a very good point. I would say that genetic criticism is in its essence a very hermeneutical perspective, so it's very much subjective. And it means that in most of the cases, even though sometimes in genetic criticism there is a tendency to reject this approach, there is in fact an a priori approach, in the sense that you approach a text already knowing a little bit what you would like to find in it or what you would like to emphasize within the text. So even though sometimes we lie to ourselves and say we are going to look to the text without having any existing prejudice and idea of how the Genesis it is or what I would like to find in it, you have this, essential framework before approaching a text. And I think that in my case, I was really focusing on the dramatic nature of the text, because I had already studied the Genesis of Pessoa poetry, orthonymous poetry in Portuguese. So these times I wanted to, as a start, of course this is just going to be a start, but I really wanted to focus to the dramatic nature of the text, and that's why I really wanted to focus on all that material evidence in the manuscripts that were somehow linked to those aspects of the text that were inherently dramatic, so stage direction, characters, relationship among them. So I think that somehow this was my my prejudice. I don't know if it was good to have it or not, but I was relieved after that because I found a lot of examples. And I should have also showed in my presentation because at the beginning I was, afraid to not find anything. At the beginning, you're always afraid to not find any relevant data. And at the end, I had so many examples, and I was so happy, and I couldn't, show the presentation. So I think that this is the framework you were referring to when I approached to the Genesis. And of course, another important thing that I mentioned in the paper that I sent you, but I think that I didn't mention today, is the fact that I always use this metaphor that genetic criticism is like looking to a text as through the keyhole of a door when you look into a room. So you never have a completely 360-degree view because there are the mental emendations, as we saw, so those moments of creative process that only occurs in the mind of the author, and we do not have evidences of it. And also, as I said, genetic criticism is hermeneutical, is very subjective. So there are also in the material evidence a lot of things that could be interpreted in an infinite ways. So it has its limitation, and in the case of the Duke of Parma, its limitation are compounded by the fact that it's chaotic and fragmentary, and a lot of variants could not be really analyzed because we see the addition, and the team was able to transcribe the addition, but wasn't able to transcribe what was there before, because it was, crossed out with a very big rage, and so we couldn't really see. So, of course, there are all of these practical limitations. In some ways, somehow, maybe the analysis of variance, if it's possible to identify patterns, could also help to the deciphering of some things, but I really do not believe that much, honestly.
So it's good that you bring the question of illegibility now, because that's my last point. And before we move to the last point, my other question is whether with this framework, so as you started to see some kind of rationale for the emendations, did you, or were you able to read, to decipher a passage, a word that had not been read by the team?
I was able to doubt some passages, but not to decipher them. That's very, very bad, because you're just saying, I think this is not that word you were thinking of, but I also do not have another word. But no, actually, I don't think I was able to decipher to find solutions. Yeah, but it is true. But they were very small suggestions, nothing so relevant, I think, yeah.
So I suppose that this is what you mean in this passage, because I had a question about this passage, but so when you say the semantic relevance of textual variants also serves as a criterion for their inclusion or exclusion from the analytical corpus, I wasn't really sure what you meant by this inclusion or exclusion from the analytical corpus?
Well, I think that here, now I have to interpret myself, but I think that here I was talking about the differentiation between meaningful corrections and not meaningful correction, in the sense like substantive and non-substantive variants, because there are a lot of variants in the Duke of Parma. There are just correction of typos and mistakes. And these variants, of course, are not useful for a critical purpose, in the sense that they are not evidence of an authorial intention of revising, but just a practical need of revising the grammar of the text. So I think that.
So now I think, is this the legibility? So again, this has to do with the moving from the scribendi to the creandi, So the fact that really this, in a way, as you say, sheds light on the dynamics of Pessoa creative practice. So your reading really goes deep into that process of the way he's revising the text and rewriting the text over time. I'm going back. Yeah. No, yeah, this is the quote that I wanted to finish with. So this comes from page 23 from your paper. The possibility of conducting an exhaustive analysis of the textual variants is further constrained by the graphic characteristics of the manuscripts themselves. In many instances, the deletion of a textual segment, most often by means of a strike-through, renders the underlying text illegible. While this difficulty is more easily overcome in the large-scale emendations, where broader textual contexts allow for the reconstruction of meaning even when individual words are obscured, it significantly limits the analysis of small-scale variants. In these cases, the corpus of an analyzable material is necessarily restricted to what remains readable and therefore intelligible. So, this is one of my favorite paragraphs from your text because of the connections that you make between the illegible and the intelligible, and then the large-scale and the small-scale processes. And actually, my first intention when I started reading, when I received your paper, I only started reading much later, but when I received your paper and I looked at the Duke, I thought, because of course, there's the Shakespearean reference, no? So I thought maybe I should look at some of the plays of Shakespeare, as Carlos was suggesting with Hamlet, I think. Was it Hamlet? Yes. This morning, I thought maybe we could, by looking at some of his intersexual references in the text, we could find a way into understanding the way he's framing the language. And again, one of the constraints, I think, and that has already come up in terms of metrics, but one of the constraints is the fact that Pessoa is working with the English language, and often when he uses English is using a certain canonical form of literary English related to the writers that he was reading, no? Renaissance writers, 19th century writers, and this type of forms of writing. So again, there's that constraint of the English expression and English sources that he's using as a motivation for his writing and an idiom for his language. But here, what really seems interesting here is that we usually neglect the illegibility in the text, because the illegibility is something that we want to get over with, to solve, and in many cases, and this was also mentioned this morning, the ambiguity cannot be solved. We cannot, sometimes it's not just that there are maybe 2 or 3 words, 3 possible readings that would fit, but sometimes it's completely illegible. We cannot make sense of the marks. And my maybe a suggestion for the team would be to highlight some of these illegible passages and put them online, for maybe create a game for readers, try to find the best guess for those. This was an idea that we had many years ago. No, so when reading this passage, I found myself thinking, what if we modeled illegible passages? What would an edition that represented these layers of illegibility beyond the facsimile presentation would look like? How could we bring that point of friction between reading and not reading into some kind of heightened awareness? Perhaps proposing to readers a deciphering game? What if we change the focus from legibility to connectivity? That is, from singling out letters, words, phrases, to the networks of additions, deletions, substitutions. So I think one thing that struck me in your text, although you want to solve the problem of illegibility, is the fact that you highlight how strong this element is when you think in terms of the underlying text, no? And so I would like to finish by proposing that we should also consider intelligibility.
Oh, you can pronounce that.
Okay, and maybe that can be also become an element in the TI encoding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlota and Professor Portela, for this thought-provoking exchange. And where is our mastermind? Yes, Professor Martinez. Can we allow 20 or 30 questions? Yes? Is that okay? So, let's start with the first. Anyone? Well, comments. Geronimo?
Well, you were, thank you a lot. Thank you very much. You were talking about variants, but did you make any kind of typology of those variants? And at the end, you were talking about those significant ones and those accidental ones. But,
yeah, I have a very big Excel file in my laptop with a classification of variants. I usually don't do classification in terms of type of variant, if it's addition, substitution, or deletion, because I really think that it doesn't say much in critical discourse. But I do have a classification, but I didn't share it with you because I have to admit that it's very chaotic and there is not so much coherence because it's a classification both in terms of textual content of the variants, so if they are modifying verbs, adjectives, nouns, but also the typology, so the case of the replacement with identical, the substitution with identical replacement, but the main focus was the classification into stage directions, paratextual annotations by Fernando Pessoa, and characters description in general, so forms of address or any type of variants that would somehow change or modify or intensify the description of the traits of a certain character. And sometimes it can be with forms of address, other times could be with adjectives. So I feel like that in general, my classification of variants is more critical than typological, so maybe it doesn't make so much sense when you look at my Excel file, but then I think it's more useful for critical analysis purposes. But yes, I did. I don't know if I will share it publicly, but yes, I did.
So, Carlota, would you like to go back to one of Professor Portela's questions, like, is there a text in this text? Mm-hmm. And maybe sort of run us through your reflections on this again, because you've talked about it, but maybe you could put everything together. Mm-hmm. And secondly, coming from outside the discipline and Pessoa and everything, what is the general agreement in Pessoan studies about what constitutes a text? Does the sort of, let's call it the professional ensemble of these eminent minds have a certain, let's say, take on the idea of text that is specific to the very peculiar, let's say, situation of this author? Well, the second one, obviously, is for the people who come from a completely different continent.
Yeah, I will not take on myself the responsibility of answering the second question because maybe Joao after can I think that when you're dealing with genetic criticism, nothing is a text and everything is a text, nor even the published version and the last and more clean possible version of a text theoretically, I'm not saying that agreeing with that, but theoretically could not be considered as a definitive endpoint, as a definite and static text. So if we are looking to the Advent text of the Duke of Parma, we could really maybe also add our presentations today, because we are speaking about the Duke of Parma. So it's very, a not definitive conception. There is really a not definitive conception of text in genetic criticism. I think that what is important is the fact that genetic criticism was important to highlight is the fact that genetic criticism deal with potentiality. So what could potentially have been there, and then it was somehow modified or rejected by the author in favor of different choices. Genetic criticism deals with textual variance. So in order to be a variance, at least two options have to be there. So I feel like, but I will not agree with myself tomorrow, but I'm being recorded, unfortunately. But I feel like that anytime there is this potentiality evidences, anytime there is versions, and version is a very tricky word to use in genetic criticism, but every time there is versions, there is a text that we can somehow interpret from a genetic perspective. And the second question I will not answer, so sorry, Diego.
I'll go back to the second question in a minute or two. More questions or remarks or comments or vivid reactions against Professor Portella's reservations as far as the notion of our own text without text, etc.?
I have one question. I would like to know more about the sequences that were most useful for you when reading the manuscripts. Like sequence could be one sentence, one line, one dialogue. And was there some differences between these sequences that were more fruitful for your interpretations?
When you speak about sequencing, you are referring to the sequence of the text? So
of your own reading of it. But
the reading of the text?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that this is useful mainly to give me a framework or on where the textual variant that I am analyzing is introduced, so which is the context. For example, when I was talking about that large-scale emendation and the fact that they are introduced with the aim of giving more, like a more detailed description of certain aspects of a character or what a character thinks about another characters, it is something that wouldn't have been possible to conclude if I was not looking to the general exchange or the general dialogue, because, for example, that large-scale emendation, what, Valerio? I think he is not a great man, and I don't remember. Of course, it makes sense, and it gives me the idea that Fernando Pessoa was really focusing on describing the idea of that characters, of Alberto's idea about Valerio, just because I look at the other parts of the dialogue, and there was no clear connection. So it wasn't not like a reply to a question. It wasn't like a continuation of the dialogue, but it was something that could have been in any other place of the piece, and it made no real links with the rest of the dialogue. So in these cases, of course, looking at the context, at the general context, and at the sequencing, it is important. But sometimes I wasn't able to do that. So at the beginning, I tried to kind of, place every manuscript, link it to a scene or an act, and kind of, order the manuscripts according to the plot. But as I told you, there are some manuscripts that are not, I wasn't able to link to the plot structure that Fernando Pessoa outlined. So there are some parts of the text that have inherently more context, and other parts of the text that are that don't really have a bigger context.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a very tentative kind of question because, like Diego, I come from outside the field. But I was wondering about the meaning of the word philology and the fact that we love the word. So in this case, what we have is somebody who is Portuguese, is educated in South Africa, and is using deliberately a Shakespearean subtext. So I was wondering how much of that kind of language enters your, or the whole team's attitude when they are trying to interpret and transcribe this. I'll give you an example. There was one page in which there is a dialogue between the Archbishop and the Duke. And it is Marino's answer to the Duke or something. And before Marino, there is a word which has been transcribed with a cross. But it is in fact Don Marino as an Archbishop. So I was wondering, in this case, I thought, okay, we have somebody writing in English, writing in Shakespearean English, but with a kind of Catholic subtext there. How much of that very complex linguistic / cultural issue is taken into consideration?
Well, I really didn't delve into this question right now because, as I was saying, I was focusing more on the dramatic aspects of a text and less on the linguistic and stylistic aspect of a text. Because I intend to, as I said, I intend to expand the event text and kind of start also focusing in the intertextual relationship between Hamlet or King Lear and in general Shakespearean drama and link it to the Duke of Parma as an exogenetic process, so how the articulation of these sources was made by Fernando Pessoa also from a stylistic perspective, but it's something that I really didn't focus on very much insofar. The only example that I showed and was basically all I was able to find and to interpret in terms of stylistics is those examples that I showed and that I found about somehow a stylistic refinement of the language that Fernando Pessoa used. But I think that I really have to focus more on the intertextual relation between external literary sources, and then how Fernando Pessoa modulates these external literary sources, also in his personal use of English with his personal references, as you were mentioning. But I have to be honest, that is a kind of analysis that I really, that I want to do and I will do, but I didn't do already because I was focusing more on the dramatic aspects of the play. But it's, yes, very, very relevant, actually. I wish I had an answer, but I don't.
Well, thank you. This is not a fully formed thought, and I'm not sure I'm capable at this point in the day to make a fully formed thought, but I find it very refreshing to focus on the stage directions and those elements of the play, to focus on the variants. I don't know where this is going to lead us to, but I find it refreshing. I feel there's something about it that is worth pursuing for sure. And I think it has to do with taking Pessoa seriously when he considers himself a dramatic poet. And I feel like his theater was neglected for so long, was not even included in some projects of critical editions. And I find there is something there. And my experience editing Marino was that some of the most interesting parts of the play were the stage directions, more insightful. And even if we're not capable of reconstructing an entire play, because we know it is impossible in the stage, I feel like they point at something fascinating and something that has echoes with the drama in gente, with the heteronyms as well. I'm very interested in how, if you're already seeing those connections in the way Pessoa think about characters and heteronyms because of the stage directions or because of those other elements that appear in a play. And we don't have to even answer now. It's just, I absolutely think it's worth pursuing, and I wonder if you're already seeing those connections between the theater per se and the meta theater of Pessoa himself because of those studies.
I feel like that until now, I have the idea that we are right when we think about Pessoa of a dramatic poet, but more in a sense of someone who writes poems in a dramatic forms rather than someone who writes dramatic texts. And I think that until now, what I was able to observe in the Duke of Parma proves somehow that, because as I mentioned, stage direction are very sporadic and only appear in specific parts of the text. And there is now a consistent addition or writing of stage directions. So I feel like that there are these, with other elements, suggest that also in the writing of this that should be a dramatic text. Fernando Pessoa was in fact writing his, Browning's-inspired dramatic poems. And also the fact that he somehow in the manuscript of the Duke of Parma adds the note, the ideas of the Duke are not the author's ideas. This is something that he could have write about any, poem of Mensagem. So I feel like that really also, like in most of the cases, the study of the Genesis of the Duke of Parma would probably just confirm things that we already think about Fernando Pessoa and not give us relevant or changeable ideas of this modus operandi as an author. But this is just a guess. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe then there will be some big revelations that I'm not foreseeing right now. But I really think that his priority was writing dialogues, writing monologues, rather than writing a piece of theater with stage directions and plots and narrative and characters entering and exiting and all of that.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. This has been a very long day, and please join me in thanking Carlota and Manuel Portela.